History time. Alright, tonight we're going to talk, disclaimer. We're going to talk about the Holocaust. And I'm going to start off with saying I'm not an anti-Semite. I'm not a Nazi. I do not think that Hitler is a good guy. I'm not prejudiced. My intention is not to offend anybody. I understand that this is a sensitive topic, and there will be some things that we talk about tonight that may be triggers to some people. And so I'm saying that up front. I'm not a Holocaust denier. I think you would probably call me a Holocaust revisionist. But that's not because I don't think that, or that's not because I think that horrible things were not done to the Jewish people. In fact, where I live here, some of my dearest friends are Jewish people, by faith or by ethnicity or both. So I'm starting off with that. But we're going to ask some questions tonight. And it's really not my intention either to state anything as fact. At least not yet. But just to ask some questions. And it's really my philosophy that it should not be offensive or dangerous to ask questions. And in fact, when we find ourselves in a place where we are unable to ask questions, in this case about the Holocaust, without being called a Nazi or an anti-Semite, that is what is dangerous. So the freedom of speech, the freedom of press, that's the significance. If everybody agreed on everything that was said, the freedom of speech would not be important. Freedom of speech is important when you say something that other people don't agree with or want to hear. So, we're going to talk about some of the questions that are brought up in this book. I understand that this title to this book is and or likely offensive to some people, particularly Holocaust survivors, Jewish people, or descendants of Holocaust survivors. I did not write this book. I did not come up with the title for this book. I read this book because I am a historian. I study history. It's a passion of mine, and I think it's important to entertain ideas so that we know whether or not we believe them. I also have a copy of Mein Kampf, and it's not because it defines my philosophy in life, or there again that I idolize Adolf Hitler. But we're going to talk about some things about World War II, specifically the Holocaust. So I just wanted to say those things up front. I'm also not a communist. And I know that because I've read a good portion of this, and I disagree with Marxism. It's not to say that I dislike somebody that maybe is a Marxist. I think it's important that we're able to agree to disagree. I'm a pacifist. I think that we should all love each other. We should encourage each other to ask questions, entertain new ideas, and that we should not fight about them. So, having said that, let's talk about some of these interesting questions. I'm also in the process of reading this book again. It's been almost 3 years, I think, since I read that book. And there are parts of it that are not an easy read. And I have to read some things sometimes 2 or 3 times to really get the contents of it. So, starting off with, also I wanted to say David Cole is a Holocaust revisionist. You don't see much of him. I don't think he's in the public eye much these days. But there was a time, I think back in the early 2000s, maybe the 90s, when he was pretty active in researching some of this stuff. He too raises some pretty interesting questions. This book is written, if you're interested, it's written by Arthur R. Butts. Interesting book. So let's start off with a lot of, at Auschwitz anyway, and let's go through the history of Auschwitz. Auschwitz was originally an army barracks. It was the home of the birth of IG Farben, a chemical company, and an artificial rubber plant. That was the purpose of Auschwitz through World War II. Synthetic rubber being vital to the German war machine, which is why it was a labor camp. And yes, Jews, Soviet prisoners of war, prisoners, outlaws, people convicted of crimes, Jehovah's Witness, gypsies, all found in the Auschwitz labor camp. Some people think that it was a death camp specifically. Was it at one time? Did it become that? We're not going to touch on that tonight, but we're going to talk about some of the things that people use as proof of what's called the final solution, or the idea that Germany wanted to exterminate the Jews. So I've not been to Auschwitz, but evidently, and I have watched like visual tours of Auschwitz, and they show piles of shoes, piles of clothes, piles of hair, piles of Zyklon B canisters, and it's used as at least evidence, or in their Auschwitz is used as proof that this was where they brought mostly Jews to exterminate them, gas them. So it brings up the question that, during World War II, during this time, in Germany and all through Europe, evidently, typhus was an epidemic. It was a huge problem. Typhus fever. And typhus is transmitted mostly by lice. And so when prisoners or captives, whatever you want to call them, mostly Jews, were brought into Auschwitz by train, they were stripped of their clothing, of their shoes. They issued them uniforms, just like you would find in prisons, and their heads were shaved. And Zyklon B, Zyklon in German, which Zyklon B was created by Germans in, I think, 1920 as a pesticide to eliminate lice, specifically to fight typhus epidemic. So it was used to delouse clothing and rooms. And so there were piles of canisters of Zyklon B because it was used to fight this epidemic of typhus. And as most people know, lice, the carrier of typhus, the primary carrier of typhus, would embed themselves in clothing and hair. So your hair was, the hair of the inmates, you would say, was shaved. They would come into the camp, they would try to stop any existence of lice before people would enter the camp to avoid lice spreading typhus throughout the camp. And so their clothes and shoes were stripped, and their hair was shaved, and they were issued uniforms. Okay, so also let me kind of back up real quick here, touching on Auschwitz. In 1947, the Nuremberg trials, as a result of the Nuremberg trials and investigations that went on, it was said that 4.4 million people died at Auschwitz, the vast majority being Jews. Since then, in 1989, that number has been changed. It has been revised to 1.1 million. In fact, I got on Google and was trying to find the 4.4 million number, and I couldn't find it. Every time I would do a Google search and how many people died at Auschwitz, the number 1.1 million would constantly come up. So that, if that number has been revised, that is a revision. So I don't know how we can dispute that or say that revisionists are incorrect. That number has been officially revised by a vast, huge number. That's a huge difference. 1.1, that's nearly, that's a quarter of what the original number was. So the number 6 million, it really is not relevant anymore. Does that mean that this is still not a horrible event in history? Well, of course it is. Of course it is. But it does mean it's been revised, and so I don't think that Holocaust revisionists should be looked at in a negative light, so and a Holocaust revisionist obviously does not mean that you're a Nazi or an anti-Semite. Are there anti-Semitic revisionists? I'm sure there are. Anti-Semitism was present in specifically Nazi Germany. Hitler, you don't have to read much of Mein Kampf to know that Hitler was an anti-Semite. So, another thing, I should have done this before I started here. If the intention was to exterminate the Jews at Auschwitz, and if that was the purpose of Auschwitz, which we know it was a synthetic rubber plant. This might be hard to find really quick here. I'm trying to find the number of ovens, and so I'll have to come back to that. I don't want to waste your time here. The number of ovens that existed, it was a very small number of ovens that existed at Auschwitz. And if their plan was to use Zyklon B to gas the Jews, kill them, and then cremate them, it seems like they would have had many, many more ovens there. And you ask, well, why were there ovens there? Well, it brings us back to typhus fever again. Excuse me. Not just typhus, but people did die there. And I'm sure people died there violently. But people also died of disease, malnutrition. And when you cremate a body, you sterilize things. And so you eliminate the risk of more disease by cremating a body. Another point this book brings up is that the labor that it took to run this plant was also vital to the German war machine. And so if this labor was so critical to the German war machine, it wouldn't make sense to gas and exterminate all of your labor. Now, could the point be made that they didn't need as many? Let's say the original, the original number being 4 million, 4 point some million, that they just didn't need that many, and anybody in excess of what they needed to run the camp was killed. That argument could be made. Sure, that argument could be made. That's a good argument. But one of the points this book brings up is that because the Allied forces knew that Auschwitz and its synthetic rubber output was very important to the war machine, and in order to run this rubber plant, they needed labor, the Allied forces actually intentionally bombed the supply lines to this labor camp to cut them off from food and supplies, rendering the free labor useless, eliminating labor. That does make sense. It makes more sense than trying to just eliminate and exterminate all of its inmates and all of its labor, which was not just the Jewish people. It was Soviet prisoners of war. I went through this, and not those people are not to be forgotten too. Another point that needs to be made is that it was not just anti-Semitism that led to the poor treatment of Jews and or responsible for what the Jews experienced in World War II. Prior to World War II, prior to Hitler coming to power in 1933, in Russia had been the Bolshevik Revolution, which was a communist revolution and was primarily, from my understanding, a Jewish, that the majority of the Bolshevik organizers of the Bolshevik Revolution were Jewish. And it was the Bolshevik Revolution that eliminated the royal Romanov family. And in 1922 and 23, I believe, under communist collectivism, upwards of 10 million Russians were intentionally starved to death. There is some dispute as to whether or not it was intentional, but I think that most historians agree that this was intentional. And while the while the Bolsheviks, or while Stalin, while Russia was selling wheat on the open market, on the world market, people in Russia were starving to death. And fast forward another 10 years, in Ukraine, the same thing happened. Under communist collectivism, upwards of 10 million people starved to death, intentionally. An intentional famine. And I think that between those years, maybe even a little earlier than 1922, but from the start of the Bolshevik Revolution, under the Bolshevik government, I don't think this is disputed a whole lot. I'm sure to some degree. 30 million people died, and a huge portion of that 30 million people were starved to death. The argument could be made that starving people to death was even more monstrous than gassing and cremating people. So, both are horrible. Both are horrible. World War II, in this period of time, even prior to World War II, is full of horrible, horrible things that happened. And what happened to the Jews was a part of all of those really horrible things that happened. So, it has to be understood, too, though, that when World War II broke out, and prior to World War II breaking out, the Germans were deathly afraid. Many of the Germans were deathly afraid of Bolshevism and communism, which is a lot to do with why the war broke out. And after World War One, when the treaty, which a treaty is supposed to be between two countries that call a truce, but that's not what happened. When countries met in France to discuss the terms, Germany was not present, and the Treaty of Versailles, however you say it. When the terms were decided on, the reparations and what was asked of the German people was also monstrous. Some estimate that 1 million Germans starved to death in the first year after World War One. Some say that's an inflated number. That might be, even if it was half that, 500,000 Germans that starved to death due to a blockade by the British not allowing supplies into Germany is an act of war. And some could say that is a Holocaust in itself. The economy was so horrible, excuse me, in Germany, all through Europe during this period of time, but the worst in Germany, that it really is what made way for what was to come. And when Hitler came into power in 1933, he kicked out the central bank. They had decided not to make good on their reparations. And they issued a fiat currency. In fact, let me back up a little bit. They kicked out the international banks, which a lot of people at that time and still today think that a lot of these international banks were run by Jewish people. And he kicked out the national bank, or the central banks, not the national banks, the central banks. And he arrested, I think it's Nathan Rothschild. He arrested a Rothschild and later negotiated a ransom to his Rothschild family. And I think still to this day is considered to be the largest ransom ever paid for a person. I forget how much that was, but you can only imagine it was a lot. These are telling things. There was a lot going on there, and it was not just a hatred for Jews. There was a lot of surviving going on. And you have to remember, too, that the international Jewish community had placed boycotts on the German people during this time. And so this only added to the climate of the time. Okay? So, back to where I was, in order for Germany to climb out of these desperate times, they kicked out the international bankers, they kicked out the central bank, they started issuing their own currency based on the labor of the German people, and they were able to bring their country back from absolute poverty. I want to say it was like I shouldn't say if I don't know, but the unemployment rate was outrageous. It was like more than 50%. And still to this day, it's considered to be the greatest economic recovery in history. I mean, what the German people did during this time economically has really never been matched. I mean, it was really amazing what they did. They went from the poorest country in Europe to one of the richest. They were able to build a war machine. Now, there's a lot of evidence to say that Hitler was not trying to go to war with the world. We're not going to get into that tonight. I'll be more versed on that. But what happened was really incredible. So, yeah, let's talk about Hollywood. Hollywood rarely talks about this other part of the story. Entertaining, some factual information there, but Hollywood is notorious for exaggerating things and or just telling, and nothing wrong with it, but just telling their the one story that they're trying to dramatize. That's a good word for it. That's what Hollywood does, is they dramatize things. And we shouldn't look to Hollywood to be our history instructors. We should leave that to the historians and the scholars, people that write books, you know. So you have to remember there was a lot more going on than just anti-Semitism. They were an enemy of the state. Many of the Jews in Germany, not all, were communist. And so this is why Jews found themselves to be enemies of the state. Okay? There was more to this story. Maybe we'll pick up where we left off tonight. Am I leaving anything out that I wanted to talk about tonight? You know, it's been said that there was a Holocaust on Germany as well, and we're going to talk about that later on. But I just wanted to bring up some of these points. You know, very seldom, I don't remember watching a movie about the Holocaust and Auschwitz. And I could be wrong. If I'm wrong or somebody knows otherwise, tell me. Leave a comment, tell me. But they never talk about Auschwitz being a synthetic rubber plant. It's always just strictly a death camp. And it was, I'm not going to say anything but, you know, but it was such a vital part of the German war machine that it just kind of doesn't make sense to think that they were just shipping people there to kill them, and that they had devised a very inefficient way of extinguishing or eliminating the Jews, exterminating the Jews, and or communist enemies of the state. So I'm gonna get into the book here a little bit more on the next episode here. Until next time, go do some of your own homework. David Cole, Ernst Zundel. There's some books that we'll talk about. I have on the way, The Seventh Million. Yeah, there's a couple more. We'll talk more about it. I'm running out. I'm starting to ramble. Till next time, thank you.